Majority of English as a second language learning takes place in outer and expanding circle countries. In this unit, we'll discuss whether or not these contexts contribute to SLA theory construction. You'll be surprised to know that the source of data for SLA theory construction mostly comes from the immigrant population residing in native English-speaking countries or the foreign students who are studying in universities in native English-speaking countries. And learners of English in the outer and expanding circle countries, who are the richest source of data for SLA theory, are completely overlooked. Because of this overlooking or complete neglect of second language learners of English in the outer and expanding circle countries, factors which are relevant to English learning, English as a second language learning, in these contexts are completely unexplored, or there's little or almost no awareness about the factors which are relevant to L2 learning of English in these contexts. So we see that there's a lot of disconnect. It is not a surprise then that there's a lot of disconnect between SLA theories and world Englishes, which are the real context of English as L2 learning. SLA, in fact, is based on certain assumptions. The first assumption is that when a person learns English as an L2, his aim or her aim is to use English to communicate with native English speakers, and therefore native English or the standard native English is the target for any L2 learning and also L2 learning of English. The second assumption that SLA makes is that the input that learners must receive in the second language, in English, should comprise the entire range and depth of British and American English. By this we mean that it should comprise the use of English in all possible domains of use and all possible levels of socio-cultural levels, which is again an impractical and impossible task. The third assumption that SLA makes is that learners have to be motivated internally. They have to have integrative motivation to learn language. By integrative motivation, we mean that they admire the English culture and language, and therefore they want to identify themselves with the English language and culture, and this should be their motivation. This desire to identify themselves and learn English language and culture should be their motivation, and there should be no practical reasons for their learning of English. Also, an assumption of SLA is that primary languages of the users or the learners are only sources of transfer. They are looked at negatively if they contribute to negative transfer, which means that if there are differences in learners' primary languages and English, these differences will interfere with the learner's learning of English. And therefore, these differences will hinder or impede, slow down the learning of English. This is called negative transfer. However, if there are similarities between a learner's primary languages and English, these similarities will contribute to positive transfer, which means that learning will be facilitated and learning will become easier for such a learner. Similarly, differences from standard British or American English are considered as failures. So if a learner falls short of reaching competence which is equal to native American or British English, the learning of such a learner is considered deficient or incomplete. In the light of these assumptions, it can be easily said that the learning of L2 in different contexts is very limited. If we base the learning or we evaluate learning of English as L2 on the basis of these assumptions, then it will limit the success rate of the learners. And scholars believe that only 5% of learners can achieve native competence in L2 if if their learning is evaluated in the light of these assumptions. All the other learners, those who are not able to reach the native-like competence, are consigned to the category of interlanguage users. And interlanguage is not the competent form of the language or the native version of the language. It is an incomplete and deficient version of the target language. So all the other learners, their learning is not acknowledged. In fact, it is rejected as interlanguage, which means deficient language.